benefits of melanin, as I just talked about. So if he is to say that, melanin is carbon 12, and it opens a whole door to so much more information that they obviously don't want people to know and to trace back to the creator, which is what we trace back to. So you got to understand, it's a lot more to all this. You still have to be a highly educated being to put this together. This is something I know people want to say, well, how do we form? How do we become humans? I know people want to think about that, but this is something that does not happen by accident. We are too complex for that. So, Khnum, molding man on the potter's wheel, is telling you that we were fashioned, that we were created. And you have to understand there's a lot more into that, which we'll get into down the road. So it's not like, Big Bang form and the planets form, and then eventually we just formed out of nowhere. We were created by something, because it's too complex to just happen, like that. You can really look at the physics of planets coming together, but us, totally different. So now when you start understanding all this stuff, when you start really getting into it, you come to the conclusion that, Black people, there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be able to manifest any physical, material thing that we want with our consciousness. Plain and simple. Especially since our subconscious is tapped into the energy of the universe. And it is. This is why I always tell you we have to gain control of the subconscious, because it's tapped in. And this is why they do everything that they do. So we do not gain control of that. But it should be no reason why we shouldn't be able to tap into it. So you got to understand, when you start really thinking about the process and thinking about how all this stuff deals with consciousness or what have you, then, you come to the conclusion that, well, consciousness is just, something that is the most powerful thing that we can really break down to. Because if consciousness is creating this energy, and this energy is creating elements, and elements creating everything that we see, then consciousness must be the creator, must be God. So you have to really, really get into this kind of information when you start studying energy. And this whole energy that I'm talking about, we tap into, is what they call the unified field. You probably heard of unified field theory, which I do not like to really dig into and talk about, because, energy is infinite. It's everywhere. When you start trying to break this stuff down into little categories and stuff like that, you lose sight of what energy goes back to. Because, we're talking about science here, and science basically deals with what they can prove. And really, when you get into it, you start tracing back this unified field, this energetic grid they want to talk about, then, really it goes back to consciousness. And you have a bunch of people who can't really conceive consciousness and really understand, consciousness. Because when you start talking about where did this energy come from, you get into the whole idea that, something can't come from nothing. And this is what a lot of people always say, well, you can't have nothing something come from nothing. There's nothing. And then how does something come out of that? What is that? And this is basically what energy does. Energy is coming from consciousness, and consciousness, so to speak, is like nothing. Consciousness can be considered God. When you read the Bible, when they say, the Christians, that God is everywhere, consciousness is everywhere. When they tell you, bow your head and pray to God or what have you, you're talking to consciousness. When you meditate, you are basically tapping into your consciousness. You are basically trying to develop your consciousness to basically, join together the masculine and feminine energy. So it's talking about consciousness when it's talking about so many different things that deal with religion. So Jesus, again, talking about going within yourself, meditating, consciousness. So these are things that it's tough for them to really grasp when it comes to this energy. So we got to understand a lot of the terms that they use, the scientific terms. If you notice me, I try to stay away from all that stuff. I try to really give it to you straight out. We can get into a lot of the technical stuff when it comes to all this stuff, but really, it's just basically what it is. You have consciousness creating energy, energy creating these elements, and then, these elements creating everything else. Now, if you really want to get into that process more, we can start thinking about sound and everything like that, and vibration and all that, as I talked about in Saturn and Satan series. All that stuff fits in. But really, to keep it basic, you have consciousness, you have energy, you have elements, you have everything else. So as they say, God is unseen. Consciousness is unseen. Consciousness created energy, and they just can't grasp that energy coming from nothing, which is why they really can't agree on unified field theory. And a lot of this, the findings and studies are, not accepted. There's a lot of issues with it. So a lot of the researchers just can't come together on unified field, which is why, it has all the problems. But now let's go back and let's get into ancient Kemet. Let's go back to ancient Kemet and let's just look at the creation story. So as I said, consciousness created energy or what have you. So you have Atum. Atum would basically be consciousness. Atum created Shu and Tefnut. So you have Shu, which would basically be energy. Tefnut, which would basically be the elements. So Shu and Tefnut, we get Nut, which would basically be the sky and, planets, the universe, or what have you, if you want to say that. And we have Geb, which would basically be, Jeb will be the earth. So you have consciousness, Atum, creating energy, Shu, and elements, which would be Tefnut. So consciousness, you have energy, you have elements, you have the creation of earth, and then you have Osiris and all the others, which would basically be aspects of nature and reality, which would be us, that exist. The sun is a major part of the whole thing, of course, because, an exploding sun is basically what created all this. So all this stuff comes together. So it's really easy to put it like that, as the Egyptians put it with the creation story, as you seeing how all this stuff comes together. Remember, out of nothing, Noon, in the waters of Noon, nothing, darkness, space, you have Atum. So Atum, consciousness. Remember, as I said before, consciousness needs existence in order for itself to exist. Consciousness needs something to perceive in order for it to exist, basically. So consciousness perceiving existence. And when it perceived existence, it became aware of itself. And then consciousness moved. And in moved, you have energy. And that takes energy to move. Any kind of movement you do is energy. So when you start going into all that, you can really start breaking down a lot of the creation stories from other civilizations as well, that really go into basically what I'm talking about as far as consciousness creating energy, energy creating elements, these elements creating everything else. So again, the ancient Egyptians was on point. The Egyptians was on point with the information. They really understood what this stuff was about. And the reason why I break it down the way I do is because they break it down so easily for people to understand. So we talked about before how a lot of people don't want to count the, let's just say, the decipherment of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And you just can't make this stuff up. The Greeks didn't know it. There's no way that they could really understand this information until they was taught by the ancient Egyptians. But the Egyptians obviously clearly had this information. And when you look at the symbols, because this is what you really have to look at, we can go by what they say, the symbols say, letter-wise or what have you. It don't always equal up. I like to read the symbols itself. I like to look at the actual symbols, and then you can start putting it together like a picture, like as far as what it's trying to say. But we can only speculate on some of the stuff, but when you start putting together the pictures and putting together information, and you start getting stuff like what I just said, it all start to make sense with actual science. So we got to think about all the civilizations that basically revere the sun and worship the sun or what have you, how they must have had this understanding about the sun and about, this whole process. So the sun, this is why they coupled the sun with Atum. So you have Atum, which I said is consciousness creating energy, elements, what have you. And they coupled them with the sun, Ra, Atum Ra, because the sun, again, exploding, that supernova creates everything too. So you have Atum Ra, you have consciousness and the sun being creators. So this is why, you had the whole thing with the sun and Atum Ra and everything else. And when you really start getting into Egyptian mythology and all the information, it just all adds up to things that we already found in science and physics. So this is stuff that it's like, when people talk this stuff about Kemet and start talking against it, what have you, It's proven. It's just no way around it. It boggles the mind when you understand how much they knew and how they metaphorically put it into these mythologies, and it all goes back and relates to math, science, physics, or what have you. It's an amazing thing. So now, of course, they had to come up with the word melanin to cover all this stuff up, because believe it or not, when they start doing their research, it all goes back to here. It's just no way around it. When you start digging and digging, because that's what I did. I did the research myself, and I started digging, and it leads you there. So, they obviously, it took them somewhere where they didn't really want to go, and they don't want people to know, thus melanin. So now also, when you look up the etymology of the word melanin, you see it's Greek, of course, Greek. So melanin, goes back to Greek. It means black. And the more interesting thing about this is the word basically began in the mid-19th century. So we're talking about the mid-1800s. So you got to ask yourself, well, damn, that's recent. What was they calling it, before that? Did they know about melanin before then? Obviously they did, because they knew about carbon. Carbon goes back to the 18th century. We're talking about the 1700s. So they knew about carbon. So they understood this stuff. So again, we're talking about a fairly new word created by the Greeks. And we know if the Greeks created it, and it pertains to black, we know what they were trying to cover up. So melanin itself means black. It goes back to blackness. It goes back to carbon, blackness. And we can understand this stuff when you really start getting into it. Now, Denzel Washington's first movie, Carbon Copy. This movie came out in 1981. It's Denzel's first movie. Now, Carbon Copy, in this movie, you have Denzel Washington, black kid, basically going to his father, played by George Segal, a white man, and telling him, hey, I'm your son. So, carbon copy means an exact copy. So it's basically a play on words, because Denzel is clearly not an exact copy of George Segal, him being carbon or melanated. So I think that, one, we have to think they could have cast a more lighter person. I always thought about that in this movie when I watched it. It's a good movie. You have to think that, damn, it would be smarter for us to cast a light-skinned black guy, to make it more believable that this black kid is from this white guy. But no, they cast Denzel, and you can see he's clearly 100% black. No way he's mixed with anything. But I think that they did that to show that, melanin is carbon. And that, too, I think they wanted to show that, the stereotypes and things that black people of color go through because of their skin color. So, I wanted to point that out. But the movie was called Carbon Copy. And, and doing this research when, it just popped up in my head, carbon copy, carbon, black, melanin, about a black kid. It can't be a coincidence. So now, as I said, I really wanted to prove my point on what I talked about in Buddhism Part 2, so you can really understand. Now, believe it or not, I have basically proven my point about the esoteric occult understanding of God goes back to the African melanated people. It's just that simple, whether you choose to accept it or not. But I'm going to go further and prove my point. So we're going to go into the Bible. We're going to go into a couple more things.